black magic spell consumes their hope and lives. A peaceful evening turns into a nightmare as James learns of his father's sudden, mysterious death. What seems like a natural passing soon reveals a terrifying secret: his family is cursed by a dark force tied to an ancient ritual gone wrong. Strange dreams, eerie warnings, and inexplicable events plague James and those around him. Black liquid oozes from the coffin, a vision of his deceased brother screams for help, and a sinister shadow begins haunting their lives. Desperate, James turns to an old hermit who unveils the horrifying truth: the curse feeds on despair, bound to claim each family member unless it's stopped. As James and his lifelong friend Edward attempt to fight back, they confront the chilling presence of the spirit and the devastating reality that it cannot be easily banished. The haunting tale of the hidden curse explores fear, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of family against the relentless grip of the unknown. Part 1. A quiet evening disrupted. The village of Willow's Hollow was nestled in a secluded valley, its winding dirt paths bordered by ancient trees whose branches seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. The villagers lived simple, predictable lives, their days governed by the rhythms of nature and their nights marked by a comforting quiet. On most evenings, the sound of distant owls and the occasional howl of a dog provided the backdrop to the serene countryside. But not tonight. James and Edward, lifelong friends, sat beneath the towering oak in James's yard, a lantern casting a soft, flickering light on the weathered chessboard between them. The old tree had witnessed countless games, arguments, and shared laughter between the two men, and tonight seemed no different. "I don't see how you're getting out of this one," Edward said, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant grin. He tapped the edge of the chessboard, emphasizing his latest move. Check. James let out a long sigh, studying the board. "You always think you've got me trapped. Just wait, I've got a plan." Edward raised an eyebrow, sipping his tea. "A plan, huh?" "I've heard that before." The two chuckled, their voices warm and unhurried. Yet, for all their levity, James couldn't shake the unease that had dogged him all day. It was an irrational feeling, a vague discomfort that refused to leave, no matter how he tried to push it aside. The air seemed heavier than usual, the distant sounds of the village quieter, as though the world were holding its breath. The gate at the edge of the yard suddenly swung open, the rusty hinges creaking loudly. Both men turned their heads toward the sound, their laughter fading. A figure stumbled through the opening, moving with urgency. James, the voice was shrill, frantic. James, it was Margaret, one of the women who worked in the village. Her hair was loose and tangled, her face pale and glistening with sweat. She clutched the edge of the gate for support, gasping for breath. James stood up immediately, his heart skipping a beat. "Margaret, what's wrong?" She staggered toward him, her movements erratic, her voice breaking as she spoke. "James, it's your father. He's gone. He's dead." The words hit James like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Edward's teacup clattered onto the table as he stood as well, his eyes wide with alarm. "What do you mean, gone?" James stammered, his voice trembling. "He was fine this morning." Margaret grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling. "Please, come now. You need to see for yourself." James didn't wait for further explanation. He broke into a sprint, his boots kicking up dust as he raced down the path toward his home. Edward was close behind, calling out to him, but James barely heard him. His mind was spinning, replaying his last conversation with his father. They had spoken that morning, laughing about the new fence James was building. His father had seemed perfectly healthy. The house came into view, but something about it felt wrong. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. It was a small detail, but it sent a chill down James's spine. His father was meticulous. He never left doors open. "Dad," James called as he approached the house, his voice breaking. The house was eerily silent, the warm hum of daily life conspicuously absent. James stepped inside, his breathing shallow. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang that made him feel queasy. He entered the bedroom, and there, on the neatly made bed, lay his father. At first glance, it looked as though he was simply asleep, his hands resting on his chest, the blanket pulled up to his waist. But the unnatural stillness of his body was immediately apparent. His face was pale, almost gray, and his lips were tinged with blue. "Dad," James whispered, moving closer. His knees buckled as he knelt beside the bed, reaching out to touch his father's hand. The flesh was cold, rigid. "No," James choked, his voice cracking as tears blurred his vision. "No, this can't be real. Wake up, Dad. Please, wake up." Edward entered the room and froze in the doorway. He removed his hat, holding it tightly against his chest, his expression a mix of shock and sorrow. Margaret stood behind him, sobbing into her hands. "He said he was tired," she whispered. "He went to lie down. When I checked on him later, he was like this. I don't understand." "He was fine earlier." James gripped his father's hand tighter, as though he could will warmth back into it. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his voice shaking. "He was fine this morning." The sound of murmuring voices outside reached his ears. The neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by Margaret's shouts and the palpable tension in the air. Among them was Mr. Howard, an elderly man known for his knowledge of old traditions and superstitions. Howard stepped into the house, his face grave. "James," he said softly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. But we must act carefully now." James looked at him, barely registering the words. "Cover his face with a white cloth," Howard continued. "Seal the room. If you are superstitious, consult the monks. Such sudden deaths, they must be handled properly. We don't want to disturb the spirits." James turned back to his father's lifeless body, his chest tightening with grief. The weight of what had happened was suffocating, yet his mind refused to accept it. Edward crouched beside him, his voice steady but filled with concern. "James, listen to me. We'll take care of this together. Your father would want you to be strong." With trembling hands, James followed Howard's instructions. The act of covering his father's face with the white cloth felt final, a painful acknowledgement of the reality he wanted so desperately to deny. As the room was sealed, a strange sensation prickled at the back of James's neck, as though unseen eyes were watching him. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as grief playing tricks on his mind. Outside, the whispers of the gathered villagers grew louder. Some murmured condolences, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "This isn't right," Howard muttered to himself as he left the house. "There's more to this than we can see." James sat on the steps of the house, staring blankly at the stars that twinkled in the night sky. The world around him felt distant, unreal, as though he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Edward sat beside him, silent for a long moment before speaking. "James, we'll get through this, one step at a time." But James didn't respond. Deep in his heart, he felt the shadows closing in, their grip tightening. The night moved on, uncaring of the grief it bore witness to. And in the stillness of the valley, something darker stirred, unnoticed by the living. Part 2. The traditional preparations. The moon hung low in the night sky, its pale glow spilling across the village like a watchful eye. Inside James's home, the air was thick with grief, the silence broken only by the muffled sobs of Margaret and the faint murmur of neighbors gathering just beyond the door. The sound of their voices, hushed and urgent, felt like the whispering of unseen forces, weaving an unseen thread through the house. James sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at his father's lifeless body. The white cloth he had placed over his father's face felt like an unbearable barrier, a final separation from the man who had raised him. His trembling hands rested on his knees, gripping them tightly to stop himself from falling apart. James Edward's voice came softly from the doorway, his tone steady but filled with concern. "They're all here. They want to help." James didn't respond at first. His mind was swirling with questions that had no answers. How could his father, so full of life, simply cease to exist? And why did it feel as though something far more sinister was lurking just out of sight? Finally, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate as though weighed down by the air itself. "Bring them in," he said hoarsely. Edward nodded, stepping aside to let the neighbors enter. The villagers moved cautiously, their eyes darting to the covered body as though afraid to look too long. Among them was Mr. Howard, a man whose age and wisdom made him a figure of quiet authority. His deeply lined face was set in a grim expression, and his dark eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room. Howard approached James, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. "My boy," he said gently, "I am truly sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man, and this is no easy thing to bear. But we must act swiftly. There are traditions that must be observed to ensure peace for him and for us." James looked at the older man, his jaw tightening. "What do you mean?" Howard's gaze flickered toward the body. "Sudden deaths, especially ones like this, they can leave doors open, doors that should remain shut. We must take precautions." The room fell silent, the weight of Howard's words settling heavily over everyone. Margaret shivered and wrapped her arms around herself, as though an unseen draft had crept into the room. "What precautions?" Edward asked, stepping forward. His tone was skeptical but not dismissive. Howard gestured toward the body. "First, the face must remain covered. It is said that an uncovered face invites wandering spirits. Second, the room must be sealed. No one enters or leaves until the rituals are complete. And finally, if there is any suspicion of foul play, spiritual or otherwise, a monk should be consulted to ensure the balance is restored." James frowned, a flicker of resistance flashing in his grief-stricken eyes. "My father wasn't a superstitious man. He wouldn't have wanted this." Howard's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "This isn't for him, James. This is for the living. Grief clouds the mind, and fear can bring things into being that shouldn't exist. Do as I say, and you'll sleep easier tonight." Reluctantly, James nodded. The villagers sprang into action, moving quietly but purposefully. The windows were shut, the curtains drawn, and the door was locked with a whispered prayer from Howard. The room, once a place of warmth and life, now felt like a tomb. As the preparations continued, Edward pulled James aside. "Do you really believe all this?" he asked in a low voice. James hesitated, glancing back at the covered body. "I don't know, but something about this doesn't feel right. My father, he wouldn't just die like that. There's something they're not telling me." Edward looked at him closely. "Do you think Howard knows more than he's letting on?" James didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to the murmuring crowd. Among the neighbors, he saw Mrs. Whitaker, the village gossip, whispering fervently to another woman. James couldn't hear what she was saying, but the way her eyes darted toward him made his skin crawl. The tension in the room was broken by the sound of soft chanting. A monk, dressed in simple robes, had arrived, his presence announced by the faint scent of incense that clung to his garments. He bowed respectfully before approaching the body. "Who called him?" James whispered to Edward. "Howard, I think," Edward replied. "He said it was necessary." The monk moved with practiced grace, his hands clasped in prayer, as he began to recite verses in a low, melodic voice. The villagers stood in a semicircle around him, their heads bowed as the rhythmic chant filled the air. James watched the scene, his unease growing with every passing moment. There was something about the chanting, the way it echoed off the walls, that made his skin prickle. It felt less like a blessing and more like an invocation. Finally, the monk finished and turned to face the crowd. "There is no curse here," he said, his voice calm and measured. "The soul has departed peacefully." The relief in the room was palpable. Margaret let out a shaky breath, and the villagers began to relax, exchanging quiet murmurs of reassurance. But James didn't feel reassured. "Are you sure?" he asked, stepping forward. His voice was sharper than he intended, drawing the monk's attention. The monk regarded him with a serene expression. "Yes, I am sure. The passing was natural. There is nothing to fear." James wanted to believe him. He wanted to accept those words and let them soothe the storm inside him. But something gnawed at the edges of his mind, a whisper of doubt that refused to be silenced. As the villagers began to disperse, Howard lingered, watching James closely. "You still feel uneasy, don't you?" he asked quietly. James nodded, his throat tightening. "It doesn't make sense, Howard. He was healthy. He was strong. People don't just..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Howard sighed, his expression shadowed. Grief does strange things to a man's mind. But if your heart tells you something is wrong, trust it. Keep your eyes open, James. The dead may rest, but the living are rarely so lucky. With that, Howard turned and left, leaving James alone in the sealed room with his thoughts. The night stretched on, oppressive and silent. James sat by the bed, staring at the cloth-covered face of his father. The monk's words echoed in his mind. There is nothing to fear, but the weight in his chest told him otherwise. A soft creak broke the silence. James turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. The room was empty. The door still locked, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. The only answer was the faint rustle of the curtains as a cold breeze slipped through a crack in the window. James shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. The room felt colder now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. "James." His heart leapt into his throat. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time clearer, and his father's name echoed faintly through the room. Tears welled in his eyes as he stared at the covered body. "Dad," he said again, louder this time. But the room remained silent. James sat back down, burying his face in his hands. The unease had grown into something much darker, a fear he couldn't explain. And as the hours dragged on, that fear refused to leave, clinging to him like a shadow. Something wasn't right. And deep down, he knew the worst was yet to come. Part 3. An ominous dream. The wind outside groaned like an old man in pain, rattling the shutters as if trying to force its way into the house. The old wood creaked with every gust, adding to the uneasy quiet that had settled inside. It had been 2 days since James's father's death, and the house no longer felt like their home. The corners of each room seemed darker now, shadows clinging to them like cobwebs. Even during the day, the sunlight felt muted, as though the house itself resisted letting light inside. Mary sat by the bedroom window, staring out into the garden where the bare branches of the old oak swayed violently in the wind. Her reflection in the glass looked pale, gaunt, haunted, even. She had barely slept since the night they sealed the room where James's father had died. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of his covered body and the oppressive silence of that night returned to her, filling her dreams with an inexplicable sense of dread. Tonight was no different. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours, but sleep eluded her. James had gone to bed earlier, his exhaustion evident, but Mary had lingered by the window, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, she lay down beside him, her body heavy with fatigue but her mind refusing to rest. The sound of the wind seemed louder now, almost deafening. It whistled through the cracks in the walls, creating an eerie, dissonant tune. And then, without realizing it, Mary slipped into sleep. The dream began softly, almost serenely. She was standing in the hallway of their home, the one she had walked down countless times. But something was different. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the light from the overhead lamp flickered weakly. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. There was no answer, only the distant sound of a door creaking open. Her heart quickened, and her feet moved on their own, carrying her toward the sound. As she neared the end of the hallway, she realized where she was headed, the room where James's father had died. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint golden light spilled out, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the floor. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the doorframe. Mary, the voice was hoarse, weak, but unmistakable. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Mr. Peterson," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Don't come in," the voice rasped. "Stay away from the shadows." The light inside the room flickered violently, and the shadows on the wall seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive. Mary's chest tightened, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet refused to move. "What shadows?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. The door creaked open wider, and she saw him. James's father sat on the edge of the bed, his head bowed, his hands trembling in his lap. When he looked up, her blood ran cold. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes hollow and filled with a deep, unsettling sorrow. "The curse," he said, his voice a ghostly whisper. "It's here. It's in the house. Protect him. Protect James." Before she could respond, the shadows in the room surged forward, spilling out of the doorway like a living tide. They stretched toward her, their elongated fingers reaching for her throat. Mary screamed, turning to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, the end of it disappearing into darkness. Behind her, the voice of James's father echoed, growing louder and more desperate. "Protect James." The shadows enveloped her, cold and suffocating, pulling her down into a void where all she could hear was the howling of the wind. Mary. Her eyes snapped open, and she bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, she didn't recognize where she was. The darkness of the bedroom felt too heavy, too oppressive, as if the dream had followed her into the waking world. Mary James was sitting beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. "You were screaming. Are you okay?" She struggled to catch her breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her entire body trembled as she tried to process what had just happened. "It was a dream," she stammered, though the words felt hollow. "It was just a dream." James frowned, his hands still on her shoulders. "You were screaming about something. What did you see?" Mary hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to shift in the corners, darker than they should have been. She swallowed hard and finally met his gaze. "I saw your father," she whispered. "He was in the room. The one where he died." James's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Mary, don't. He said." "The curse is here," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "He said it's in the house, and we need to protect you." James released her shoulders and stood up, running a hand through his hair. "It was just a dream," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It wasn't just a dream," Mary insisted, her eyes wide and pleading. "It felt real, James. He was trying to warn us." James turned away from her, staring at the closed door of their bedroom. The wind outside had grown louder, rattling the windows as though demanding to be let in. He wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, a product of their grief and the stress of the past few days. But deep down, he couldn't shake the unease her words stirred in him. "James," Mary said softly, her voice trembling. "You believe me, don't you?" He turned back to her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted, "but if there's something going on, we'll figure it out. Together." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Mary sat by the window, staring out into the garden, while James remained in bed, staring at the ceiling. Neither of them could shake the feeling that the house was no longer their own. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. The wind had died down, but the air was still heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. James sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in front of him, while Mary hovered nearby, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shawl. "Do you think it's true?" she asked hesitantly. James didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window at the oak tree, its bare branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. Finally, he said, "I don't know, but I feel it too. Something's wrong." Mary sat down across from him, her hands clutching his. "We have to do something, James. We can't just wait for whatever this is to destroy us." He nodded, though his expression was grim. "We'll figure it out. Whatever this is, we'll stop it." But as they sat there, the faint sound of whispers filled the air, so soft they could have been mistaken for the wind. And in the darkest corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift, watching, waiting. Part 4. The Black Liquid. The air in the house was thick with the weight of unspoken fears, grief, and an unease that had been growing since the day James's father passed. The family had gathered to finalize the funeral arrangements, each person moving with a heavy heart and solemn purpose. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windows, as though nature itself mourned alongside them. James stood in the corner of the room, watching as the coffin was carefully placed on a low table by the undertaker and a few neighbors. The coffin was a simple design, wooden with a polished finish, adorned only with a small brass plaque bearing his father's name. Its presence seemed to command the attention of the room, an unspoken reminder of the reality they all wanted to avoid. Mary clung to James's arm, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't spoken much since the ominous dream 2 nights ago, but her unease was palpable. James glanced at her, his own anxiety mirrored in her eyes, and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. The family gathered around, their quiet murmurs blending with the rhythmic tapping of the rain. Edward, standing closest to James, leaned in and whispered, "This doesn't feel right." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward hesitated, his eyes fixed on the coffin. There's something off about all of this. First your father's sudden death, then Mary's dream. It's too much." James opened his mouth to reply, but a sharp gasp from across the room silenced him. Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Whitaker, who had been adjusting the flowers near the base of the coffin. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock and her hand trembling as she pointed downward. What is that?" she stammered. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. As he approached, the stench hit him, a rancid, overpowering odor that made his stomach churn. It smelled of decay, of something long dead and buried. Then he saw it. A thick, black liquid was oozing from the bottom of the coffin, pooling on the floor beneath it. The substance was viscous, almost tar-like, and it glistened unnaturally under the dim light of the room. "What the hell is that?" Edward muttered, taking a step back. The undertaker, a stoic man with decades of experience, crouched down to inspect the liquid. He dipped his finger into it hesitantly, only to recoil as if burned. "It's warm," he said, his voice tinged with confusion and fear. "It shouldn't be warm." Murmurs rippled through the room as the family exchanged uneasy glances. Mary tightened her grip on James's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is happening?" "I don't know," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes remained fixed on the black liquid, his mind racing. Edward leaned closer to James, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't normal. You know that, right? This death, your father's death, it wasn't ordinary." James turned to him sharply. "Don't start with that now, Edward." But Edward didn't back down. "Look at that," he gestured toward the liquid. "Tell me you've seen something like this before. Tell me this isn't some kind of..." Warning, the word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. James wanted to dismiss it, to tell Edward he was being ridiculous, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his friend was right. The undertaker stood, wiping his hands on a cloth with a troubled expression. "I've handled dozens of funerals, but I've never seen anything like this," he said. I think the coffin should be open." A collective gasp went through the room. "Open," Mary whispered, her face draining of what little color it had left. "Yes," the undertaker said firmly. "We need to see what's causing this. It could be a leak." Or he trailed off, unwilling to voice his darker suspicions. James hesitated, his instincts screaming against the idea. But before he could speak, a loud knock echoed through the room. It wasn't the knock of a visitor at the door, it came from the coffin. Everyone froze. The sound came again, louder this time, as if something inside the coffin was desperately trying to escape. Mary let out a choked sob, clinging to James as he took a step back. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in panicked whispers. "Did you hear that? It's impossible, something's in there." The undertaker raised his hands, calling for silence. "Everyone, calm down. It could be." The wood settling, but no one believed him. James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the knocking stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. He stared at the coffin, his mind racing with possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. And then it happened. His vision blurred, the room around him fading into darkness. He tried to steady himself, reaching out for Mary, but his hand passed through her, as though she wasn't there. He was no longer in the room. James stood in a field shrouded in fog, the air cold and damp against his skin. In the distance, he saw a figure, a boy no older than 10, running toward him. His heart clenched as recognition struck. It was his younger brother, Daniel. "Daniel," James called, his voice echoing strangely in the mist. Daniel didn't stop. His face was twisted in fear, his eyes wide and glistening with tears. "Help me," he cried. "James, help me." James started to run toward him, but the ground beneath his feet turned soft, pulling him down like quicksand. He struggled, reaching out for his brother, but the distance between them only grew. James, Daniel's voice was shrill with terror. He stumbled, falling to the ground as the fog thickened around him. "Don't let them take me, take you," James shouted, his voice breaking. "Who?" Daniel, who before his brother could answer, a shadow emerged from the fog, tall, thin, and unnaturally elongated. It reached for Daniel, its fingers stretching like tendrils of smoke. "Run!" James screamed, but Daniel was frozen in place, his face pale with fear. The shadow engulfed him, pulling him into the mist. "No!" James shouted, surging forward. But as he reached the spot where Daniel had been, the fog dissolved, leaving only the faint echo of his brother's voice. "James." The sound of Mary's voice jolted him back to reality. He was in the room again, surrounded by his family. Mary was shaking him, her face streaked with tears. "James, what happened?" she cried. He looked around, disoriented. The black liquid still seeped from the coffin, its stench permeating the air. But the knocking had stopped, and the room was eerily quiet. James turned to Edward, his voice shaking. "It's not over," he said. "It's not over." The words sent a chill through everyone present. The coffin loomed before them, a silent, menacing presence, as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper. Part 5. The Hermit's Revelation. The rain was relentless, battering against the roof of James's home with a force that seemed almost personal. The once cozy house now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him as fear and grief coiled tightly around his chest. Mary had begged him to stay, her tear-streaked face a reflection of her own terror. But he couldn't. He needed answers, and there was only one person left in the village who might have them: the Hermit. For years, the Hermit had lived alone in the dense forest at the edge of the valley, her presence the source of whispered rumors and superstitions. Some claimed she was a healer, others that she dabbled in dark magic. Children dared one another to approach her house, their laughter masking their unease. But tonight, James didn't care about the stories. He needed her help, no matter the cost. With a lantern in hand and his coat pulled tightly against the rain, he set off into the storm. The forest loomed before him, its trees twisting and swaying under the weight of the wind. The path was treacherous, thick with mud and tangled roots, but he pressed on, each step driven by desperation. The deeper he ventured, the quieter the storm seemed to grow, as though the trees themselves were absorbing the sound. The lantern's light flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying branches. Finally, he saw the Hermit's house. It was a crooked, weathered structure nestled between two massive oaks, its windows glowing faintly with a flickering amber light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm. James hesitated, his courage wavering as he approached the door. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around him, as though the trees were watching, waiting. Gathering his resolve, he raised his hand and knocked 3 times. The door creaked open almost immediately, revealing a woman who looked far younger than he had expected. Her face was sharp and angular, her eyes dark and piercing, as though they could see straight through him. Her long hair, streaked with gray, hung loosely over her shoulders, and she wore a simple robe that seemed untouched by the rain. "You're late," she said, her voice low and calm, as though she had been expecting him. Without waiting for a response, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. James swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with jars, dried plants, and objects he couldn't begin to identify. In the center of the room, a fire crackled in a small hearth, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. "Sit," the Hermit said, pointing to a wooden stool by the fire. James obeyed, his hands gripping the lantern tightly as he struggled to find the words. I need your help," he began, his voice trembling. Something is happening to my family. My father is dead, my wife is having nightmares, and now there's something in the house. I don't know what to do. The hermit studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she knelt before the fire and began stirring a pot of bubbling liquid. "Do you know why this is happening?" she asked, her tone neutral. James shook his head. "No, that's why I came to you. Please, if you know anything, tell me." The hermit glanced at him over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "It's not what's happening now that you should fear," she said cryptically. "It's what was set into motion long before you were born." James frowned, confusion and frustration bubbling up inside him. "What do you mean?" "What was set into motion?" The hermit stood and turned to face him, her hands folded in front of her. "Your bloodline is cursed," she said simply. The words hit James like a blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Cursed," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The hermit nodded. "Long ago, one of your ancestors performed a ritual, one they didn't fully understand. It was meant to bring prosperity, but something went wrong. Instead of invoking a blessing, they summoned a spirit. A dark, hungry spirit." James's heart pounded in his chest. "What kind of spirit?" "A parasite," she replied, her voice sharp. "It feeds on despair, on fear. It attaches itself to a bloodline, binding itself to each generation, and it won't stop until it consumes everything." James felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. "How do I stop it?" he asked desperately. The hermit's expression darkened. "Stopping it won't be easy. It's been feeding on your family's pain for centuries. Every tragedy, every heartbreak, it's grown stronger with each one. To sever the bond, you'll have to confront it directly." "Confront it," James repeated, his stomach twisting. The hermit stepped closer, her gaze intense. "The spirit is in your house, James. It's there because it senses an opportunity, your grief, your fear. It's growing bolder, and soon it will take something else, unless you stop it." James's mind raced. The black liquid, the knocking from the coffin, his vision of Daniel, everything was connected. "How do I confront it?" he asked, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. The hermit moved to one of the shelves, pulling down a small, worn book bound in cracked leather. She handed it to him, her fingers lingering on the cover. "This will guide you," she said. "But be warned, the spirit is cunning. It will use your pain against you. You'll need to be strong, stronger than you think you can be." James took the book, his hands trembling. "And if I fail?" The hermit's eyes darkened further. "If you fail, the spirit will take what it wants, your family, your life, your soul, and it will move on to the next generation, stronger than ever." The fire crackled loudly, as if punctuating her words. James clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the book. "I won't fail," he said, though the words felt hollow. The hermit nodded, a flicker of something resembling pity crossing her face. "Then go. Time is running out." James stood, the weight of the book in his hands feeling heavier than it should. As he stepped toward the door, the hermit's voice stopped him. "James," he turned back, his heart pounding. "Remember," she said, her tone grave. "It's not just your life at stake. The spirit feeds on despair. If you give it what it wants, it will never stop." James nodded, his throat tightening. Without another word, he stepped out into the storm. The rain had lessened, but the forest felt darker now, the shadows pressing closer as he made his way back home. The lantern's light flickered weakly, and every rustle of leaves sent his heart racing. When he finally reached the house, he paused at the gate, his eyes fixed on the windows. The faint glow of light from inside felt more like a warning than a welcome. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, the hermit's words echoing in his mind. "The spirit is in your house, and it was waiting." Part 6. The haunting begins. The air in James's house had changed. It no longer felt like a home. The familiar warmth and safety were gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill that refused to dissipate. Shadows seemed to linger too long in the corners, their shapes stretching unnaturally in the flickering light of the lanterns. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the sense of being watched. James sat at the kitchen table, the hermit's ancient book spread out before him. Its brittle pages were filled with cryptic symbols and strange instructions, written in a language he didn't recognize. Beside him, Edward leaned back in his chair, his face pale but resolute. "We have to try something," James muttered, his voice tight with exhaustion. He hadn't slept in days, the weight of the curse pressing on him like a physical force. Edward nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "But what if we make it worse? What if the rituals?" "I don't know," James's jaw tightened. "It's already feeding on us, Edward. On our fear, our grief. If we do nothing, it wins." Edward didn't argue. The memory of the black liquid oozing from the coffin and the deafening knocks that had come from within were still fresh in his mind. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop on its own. The two men began preparing for the first ritual. The book's instructions were vague and unsettling, requiring the placement of candles in precise arrangements and the burning of herbs that smelled acrid and strange. Mary watched from the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't said much since James returned from the Hermit's house, but her wide, fearful eyes spoke volumes. As night fell, the house grew colder. The sound of the wind outside intensified, howling like a wounded animal. James lit the last candle and stepped back, his heart pounding. "All right," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Let's begin." Edward nodded, holding the book open as James began to chant the words inscribed on the page. The language felt foreign and unnatural on his tongue, each syllable heavy with an ominous weight. At first, nothing happened. The candles flickered, their flames steady in the otherwise still room. But then, a low hum began to resonate through the house. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, until the very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James, before he could respond, the kitchen door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The noise echoed through the house, and the hum stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt suffocating. "Did you see that?" Edward whispered, his voice trembling. James didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Slowly, he stepped forward and reached for the handle. As his fingers brushed the cold metal, the whispers began. At first they were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. But as James pulled the door open, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were angry, accusing, filled with a malice that made his skin crawl. James. James, the sound of his name sent a jolt of terror through him. He stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The only response was a burst of laughter, sharp, high-pitched, and cruel. It echoed through the house, fading into silence as abruptly as it had begun. Edward stepped forward, his face pale. "James, we need to keep going." "We can't stop now," James nodded, though his hands were trembling as he picked up the book again. He began to chant once more, his voice unsteady but determined. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching upward, as if trying to escape the oppressive darkness that filled the room. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. Mary let out a strangled cry, pointing toward the far corner of the room. "There," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. James and Edward turned to look, and their blood ran cold. A figure stood in the corner, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadow, but its presence was overwhelming. The air around it seemed to ripple, and its eyes, two pinpricks of glowing red, stared unblinkingly at James. "Keep chanting," Edward shouted, his voice shaking. James forced himself to continue, his voice rising above the whispers that filled the room. The figure didn't move, but its gaze seemed to burn into him, filling his mind with images of despair and death. The temperature in the room plummeted, and James could see his breath in the air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Stop," Mary screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop," James's voice faltered, and in that moment the figure moved. It surged forward, its shadowy form stretching toward him with impossible speed. "No," Edward shouted, grabbing James and pulling him back. The two men stumbled, knocking over the candles and plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then, the laughter returned low and mocking, echoing through the house like a cruel taunt. The figure was gone, but the oppressive presence remained. James collapsed into a chair, his body shaking uncontrollably. "It's stronger than us," he whispered. "We can't fight it." Edward knelt beside him, his expression grim. "We can't give up, James. If we stop now, it'll destroy everything." Mary sank to the floor, her sobs racking her body. "It's already destroying us," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's not going to stop." The three of them sat in silence, the weight of their failure pressing down on them like a physical force. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a beast in pain. And somewhere in the house, the whispers began again, soft and insidious, promising more terror to come. Part 7. Confronting the Spirit. The night was unnaturally quiet. The storm that had raged for days had finally died down, but the stillness it left behind was far more unsettling. The air in the house was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint scent of burning candles lingered even though they had long since been extinguished. James sat in the dimly lit living room, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Edward and Mary had begged him not to stay up alone, but he'd sent them to bed, insisting that he needed time to think. The truth was, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that figure in the corner, its glowing red eyes burning into his soul. He could feel its presence now, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to watch him from the shadows. The whispers had started again, faint and fragmented, like voices carried on the wind. James, the sound of his name made him flinch. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. "If you're here, show yourself." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a single, chilling laugh. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching and shifting until they coalesced into a single shape. It stood at the far end of the room, its form grotesque and unnatural. Its body was impossibly thin, its limbs long and twisted as though they had been broken and reset in all the wrong ways. Its face, or what remained of it, was a hollow mask, its empty eye sockets glowing faintly with a sickly red light. James's breath caught in his throat as the creature stepped forward, its movements jerky and inhuman. "You wanted to see me," it rasped, its voice like the sound of dry leaves scraping across stone. "Here I am." James swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand his ground. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure the spirit could hear it. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling but firm. The spirit tilted its head, its hollow eyes narrowing. "What am I?" it repeated, its tone mocking. "I am the shadow that clings to your family, James. I am the curse you cannot escape." James clenched his fists. "Why? Why my family? What did we do to deserve this?" The spirit's laughter filled the room, cold and cruel. "Deserve it?" echoed. "You speak as though I chose this. But no, James, your family chose me." "That's impossible," James shouted, his anger momentarily overpowering his fear. "We would never, wouldn't you?" the spirit interrupted, taking another step closer. The room seemed to grow darker with every movement it made. "Long ago, one of your ancestors saw power, wealth. They were willing to do anything to achieve it, even call upon forces they didn't understand. And so they summoned me." James shook his head, his chest tightening. "That was generations ago. Why are you still here? Why punish us for their mistakes?" The spirit's hollow eyes glowed brighter, and its lips twisted into a grotesque grin. "Because your family is mine," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Every sorrow, every loss, every drop of despair you have fed me for centuries, and you will continue to do so until there is nothing left." James took a step back, his legs trembling. "No," he whispered. "I won't let you take any more from us." The spirit tilted its head again, as though amused. And what will you do, James? Chant your little words? Light your little candles? You've already failed. The words cut deep, but James forced himself to stand tall. You're wrong, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. You're nothing but a parasite. You feed on our pain, but you only have power because we let you. The spirit's laughter turned into a snarl, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep across the windows, and James could see his breath in the air. You think you can defy me, the spirit hissed, its voice filling the room. I have claimed so many of your family before you, James. Do you remember your brother? Daniel. James froze, his stomach twisting. What about him? The spirit's grin widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. He cried for you, it said, its voice gleeful. He begged for you to save him. But you didn't, did you? You let him fall. No, James shouted, his voice breaking. That's not true. The spirit raised a claw-like hand, and the shadows on the wall shifted, forming images that made James's blood run cold. He saw Daniel, his face pale and streaked with tears, reaching out for help as the darkness swallowed him whole. Stop it, James yelled, his voice desperate. You're lying. The spirit leaned closer, its face mere inches from his. Am I? It whispered. Or are you finally seeing the truth? James felt a surge of anger rise within him, overpowering his fear. You don't control me, he said through gritted teeth. And you won't take anyone else. Not my wife. Not my friends. No one. The spirit recoiled slightly, its grin faltering. You are bold, it said, its tone laced with contempt. But boldness won't save you. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the Hermit's book. He opened it to the page she had marked and began to chant the words written there. His voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger with each word. The spirit let out a deafening roar, its form writhing and twisting as though in pain. The shadows in the room began to retreat, and the oppressive weight lifted slightly. You think this will stop me? The spirit snarled, its voice filled with rage. You are nothing without your fear, James. You cannot escape me. James continued to chant, his voice unwavering. The spirit's form flickered, becoming less solid with each passing second. Finally, with one last roar, it disappeared, leaving behind only silence. James collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with exhaustion. The book slipped from his hands, landing with a soft thud beside him. Mary and Edward burst into the room, their faces pale with fear. James, Mary cried, rushing to his side. What happened? It's gone, James said weakly. For now, Edward helped him to his feet, his expression grim. But it'll come back, won't it? James nodded, his eyes filled with determination. Yes, he said. But next time, we'll be ready. The three of them stood in the dimly lit room, the faint sound of whispers lingering in the air. Though the spirit was gone, its presence still loomed, a reminder that the battle was far from over, and somewhere in the darkness it was waiting. Part 8. The Banishing Ritual. The night outside was still and unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. No stars pierced the thick veil of clouds, and even the wind, so relentless in past nights, had gone silent. Inside the house, the air was heavy, thick with an unspoken dread that pressed down on James, Mary, and Edward like an invisible weight. The Hermit's ancient book lay open on the dining table, its yellowed pages illuminated by the flickering light of several candles placed meticulously in a circular arrangement on the floor. Strange runes and symbols filled the pages, their intricate designs seeming to shift and shimmer when viewed for too long. James stood at the edge of the circle, the lines of chalk he had drawn glowing faintly under the candlelight. His hands trembled as he held the book, its fragile pages marked with an incantation that promised to rid his family of the spirit once and for all. But promises from a centuries-old text, handed down by a mysterious hermit, offered little comfort. Are you sure about this? Edward asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. His eyes darted nervously toward the darkened corners of the room, as if expecting the spirit to materialize at any moment. I don't have a choice, James replied, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. He turned to Mary, who sat clutching her shawl, her face pale and etched with worry. Stay outside the circle. No matter what happens, You don't come in. Promise me." Mary nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Be careful," she whispered. James stepped into the center of the circle, the book held tightly in his hands. He knelt before a wooden bowl filled with herbs, oils, and a scrap of fabric he had taken from his father's room. The mixture was pungent, its sharp, acrid scent filling the room. Around him, the candles flickered, their flames casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. "Edward," James said, glancing at his friend. "If anything goes wrong, get Mary out of here." Edward hesitated but nodded. "I will." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his trembling hands. He had spent hours studying the incantation, repeating the foreign, guttural words until his tongue felt numb. Now, as he prepared to say them aloud in the presence of the very entity he sought to banish, his confidence wavered. "It's just words," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Words can't hurt me." But as he began to chant, the house seemed to come alive. The first syllables fell from his lips, low and halting, the unfamiliar language scraping against his throat. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending and twisting as though buffeted by an unseen wind. The air grew colder, each breath forming a visible mist that lingered unnaturally in the still air. The symbols drawn in chalk around the circle began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with James's voice. The room grew darker, the shadows on the walls deepening until they seemed to move with a life of their own. "James." The voice was a low, guttural whisper, but it came from everywhere at once. James faltered, his chanting breaking for a moment as he looked around the room. "Don't stop," Edward shouted, his voice trembling with fear. James forced himself to continue, his voice rising above the whispers that began to fill the room. The words spilled from his mouth faster now, each syllable blending into the next as the incantation reached its crescendo. The chalk runes flared brighter, their light illuminating the room in harsh, unnatural bursts. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, coalescing into a single, towering figure. It stood just outside the circle, its form grotesque and ever-shifting. Its body was a mass of darkness, limbs too long and jagged, its face a hollow void with two glowing red eyes that burned with a malevolent light. "The spirit had come. You dare summon me," it hissed, its voice resonating through the room like a rumble of thunder. James clenched the book tighter, his heart pounding. "I'm not summoning you," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm banishing you." The spirit tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a chill down James's spine. "Banishing me," it repeated, mockery dripping from its tone. "You think you have the power to cast me out? You, who have fed me for generations." James ignored its taunts and continued chanting, his voice rising as he poured every ounce of strength he had into the words. The spirit let out a low, guttural laugh that shook the very walls of the house. "Foolish child," it snarled. "You are mine. Your family has always been mine." The runes on the floor flared brighter, their light burning against the encroaching darkness. The spirit recoiled slightly, its form flickering, as though struggling to maintain its shape. "You're weak," James shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't survive without us. That's why you're here, isn't it? To feed on our pain, our fear." The spirit's laughter turned into a deafening roar, and it lunged toward the circle, its clawed hands outstretched. But it stopped just short, the glowing runes forming an invisible barrier that held it back. James's chanting reached its peak, the final words of the incantation echoing through the room. The bowl in front of him ignited, its contents bursting into flames that burned with an intense, otherworldly light. The spirit shrieked, its form writhing violently as the light consumed it. The sound was deafening, a mix of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "You can't banish what's already inside you." The spirit screamed, its voice filled with a chilling certainty. With one final, ear-splitting shriek, the spirit vanished, leaving behind only silence. James collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The candles flickered weakly before going out, plunging the room into darkness. Mary rushed to his side, her voice choked with tears. "Are you okay?" He nodded weakly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's gone," he whispered. Edward knelt beside him, his face pale but relieved. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it," but James didn't respond. The spirit's final words echoed in his mind. A dark warning that refused to be silenced. "You can't banish what's already inside you." The relief in the room was short-lived. The house was quiet again, but the air still felt heavy, as though the shadows themselves were holding their breath. Mary helped James to his feet, her hands trembling. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely audible. James looked around the room, his eyes scanning the darkened corners where the spirit had once stood. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it feels like something is still here." The three of them stood in silence, the faint sound of the wind outside the only noise. Though the spirit was gone, its presence lingered, a dark promise that the battle was far from over. And somewhere in the depths of the house, unseen and waiting, the curse remained. Part 9. A cycle without end. The first light of dawn crept through the windows of the old house, casting pale, uncertain rays that barely reached the far corners of the room. James sat alone at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, the faint smell of burnt herbs and wax lingering in the air. His body was sore, his hands trembling, but the ache in his chest felt far heavier than his physical exhaustion. The spirit was gone for now. The oppressive presence, the whispers in the dark, and the suffocating shadows had dissipated with the ritual. Yet the house felt no less heavy, no less haunted. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the faint creak of the wooden beams as the house settled. Outside, birds began their tentative calls, as if unsure it was safe to sing. James stared at the faint golden glow of the horizon through the kitchen window, but the light brought no solace. He rubbed his hands over his face, the stubble on his jaw prickling his palms. His mind replayed the events of the night in fragments, the glowing runes, the spirit's twisted form, its deafening shriek as it dissolved into nothingness. But what haunted him most were its final words, spoken with a chilling certainty. "You can't banish what's already inside you." The words had embedded themselves in his thoughts like barbs, refusing to let go. A floorboard creaked behind him, and James turned sharply, his heart pounding. It was only Mary, her pale face framed by disheveled hair as she stepped cautiously into the room. "You're still awake," she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. "I couldn't sleep," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't feel over." Mary sank into the chair across from him, clutching a mug of tea that had gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the ceramic, seeking warmth. "The house feels different," she said, "but not better. Like it's waiting for something." James nodded, his gaze distant. "It is. It always has been." Mary frowned. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "The spirit. It wasn't just haunting us. It's part of us, of this family. It said so last night." Mary's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "You don't believe that, do you?" "That thing was evil. It would have said anything to hurt you." "Maybe," James said quietly. "But what if it wasn't lying? What if we are cursed?" "The Hermit said it started generations ago. What if it's never going to stop?" Mary didn't respond, her silence an answer in itself. James leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. The memories of his father and his brother Daniel flooded his mind. His father's death had been the catalyst, but Daniel's loss had been the first true crack in their family. He could still see Daniel's face as clearly as if it were yesterday. The laughter they'd shared as boys, the way Daniel had always tried to keep up with him despite being younger, and the guilt that James carried, knowing he hadn't been there when Daniel needed him most. "You let me fall." The spirit's mocking words echoed in his mind, twisting like a knife. James closed his eyes, his fists clenching. "It wasn't my fault," he whispered to himself, but the words sounded hollow. "You've always blamed yourself." James flinched at Mary's voice, realizing he had spoken aloud. She reached across the table, placing a trembling hand over his. "It wasn't your fault, James. What happened to Daniel? You were just a boy. You couldn't have known." James met her gaze, his eyes filled with pain. "But I should have been there. If I'd been there, maybe." "Stop," Mary said firmly, her voice breaking. "This thing, it's what the spirit wanted. to use your guilt, your pain against you. Don't let it win." James didn't answer. He pulled his hand away gently and stood, walking to the window. The sunlight had grown stronger now, casting long shadows across the yard. The old oak tree stood tall and unyielding, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like a silent sentinel. He thought of his father, of the man who had always seemed invincible, the man who had taught him to climb that very tree, who had laughed as he hoisted him onto his shoulders after a successful harvest. And yet, in the end, even his father had been taken by the curse, leaving behind only questions and sorrow. James Edward's voice came from the doorway. He looked as haggard as the rest of them, his eyes bloodshot and his shirt wrinkled. "I thought I'd find you here," James turned, nodding in acknowledgement. "Couldn't sleep," Edward let out a bitter laugh. Who could? After that he stepped closer, his expression grim. "We won last night." "But it didn't feel like a victory," it wasn't, James said flatly. Edward frowned. "The spirit is gone." "Isn't that what matters?" James hesitated, then shook his head. "It's not gone. Not really. It's part of this family, Edward. It's in our blood. The Hermit was right, it feeds on us, generation after generation. And unless we figure out how to break it completely, it'll come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday." Edward's face hardened, but he didn't argue. "Then we'll figure it out. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to end this," James nodded, though the weight of Edward's words felt crushing. "It's not just about ending it for us," he said. "It's about the next generation. If we don't stop it, our children, their children, they'll suffer the same fate." Mary stood and walked to James's side, her eyes filled with determination despite her fear. "Then we won't stop until it's over," she said. "We'll find the answers, James." Together the three of them stood in the kitchen, the light of dawn growing stronger with each passing minute. The house, though still heavy with the echoes of what had transpired, seemed to breathe with them, as if it too hoped for salvation. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit's words were more than a taunt, they were a warning. You can't banish what's already inside you. The curse wasn't just a haunting. It was a cycle, a dark thread woven into the fabric of his family's history. And breaking that thread would require more than rituals or chants. It would require confronting the truth of what his ancestor had done and the price they had paid. As the first rays of sunlight finally spilled fully into the house, James closed his eyes and made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would end the curse. Not just for himself, but for his family, for his father, his brother, and the generations yet to come. But deep down, he knew the road ahead would be long. The spirit may have been vanquished for now, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would not be easily dispelled. The haunting was not a single event. It was a cycle without end, and James was determined to break it.